100,000 years ago, two groups of humans meet for the first time. They've never seen each other before. One group has darker skin, one has lighter eyes. Neither has ever heard the word race. So what happens next? Do they fight? Do they trade? Do they even notice the difference? Here's the strange truth. The thing we call racism, judging people by skin color, is almost certainly one of the youngest prejudices humans have ever invented. But that doesn't mean our ancestors were free of hatred. They had something else, something older, and in some ways, more dangerous. Let's start with the obvious question. Did skin color even matter to early humans the way it matters today? Here's the catch. For most of human history, the groups our ancestors actually met were not dramatically different in skin tone. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago, dark-skinned, adapted to intense UV light. As small groups slowly migrated north over tens of thousands of years, skin gradually lightened, generation by generation, in response to weaker sunlight. This wasn't a switch, it was a multi-thousand-year drift. That means two bands of early humans bumping into each other 50,000 years ago almost certainly looked far more alike than a modern Norwegian and a modern Nigerian. The dramatic skin color spectrum we associate with race today didn't fully exist yet. There was no global contrast to even notice. So if it wasn't skin, what did trigger suspicion, fear, even violence between early human groups?
The answer's older than race, and arguably more hardwired. In-group versus out-group. Human brains evolved in small bands. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar's research suggests our ancestors could really only track around 150 individuals as complex, trusted people, what's now called Dunbar's number. Human evolution primarily occurred in small hunter-gatherer groups rather than larger, more recently settled societies. Everyone inside that circle of 150 was family, ally, known. Everyone outside it was a stranger. And strangers were dangerous, not because of how they looked, but because they were unknown. This is tribalism in its rawest form. In its negative sense, tribalism describes discriminatory attitudes toward outsiders, driven purely by loyalty to one's own group. It didn't require skin color. It didn't require language differences even. Just the line between us and everyone else. Evidence of this runs deep. Skeletal trauma at sites across Europe and Africa shows violence between competing bands long before recorded history, territorial disputes, resource conflicts, kin group raids. The aggression was real, but it was aimed at outsiders as a category, not at any particular physical trait. So when did physical appearance start to carry meaning? Surprisingly late, and even then, not the way you'd expect. Ancient civilizations absolutely noticed physical differences once long-distance contact began, through trade routes, migration, conquest. But societies in the ancient world tended to interpret those differences through a lens of environment and circumstance, not fixed biology. Greek and Roman writers largely explained human variation as a result of climate and geography, not inherent hierarchy. That's a critical distinction. Ancient prejudice was usually about group identity, your tribe, your city, your language, your customs, not a belief that your bloodline was permanently biologically superior. Classical societies invested far more importance in tribal or familial affiliation than physical appearance, even while still assigning the harshest judgments to outsiders. One historian, describing foreign peoples in 3rd century China, compared them to monkeys, framing them as a lesser, almost subhuman lineage, proof that othering outsiders is ancient, but it was about culture and foreignness first.
So if not in deep prehistory, when did race, the concept we recognize today, actually get invented? The word itself didn't even exist in its modern form until shockingly recently. The term was used in the 16th century to mean something closer to nation or ethnic group, not biology. It wasn't until the rise of European colonial expansion and transatlantic slavery that race started hardening into something else, a fixed, supposedly biological category used to justify permanent hierarchy. And then came the part that should genuinely shock you. Between the 1800s and mid-1900s, not ancient times, the industrial age, scientists increasingly used pseudo-scientific methods to justify racial hierarchies, moving toward the idea that each race had a separate origin with fixed, different traits in intelligence and temperament. This is when so-called scientific racism was manufactured, dressed up in the language of biology to make an old social prejudice look like settled fact. In other words, modern racism wasn't an ancient instinct that just got more sophisticated. It was largely built, on purpose, in specific people in a specific century for specific economic and political reasons. Here's where it gets even stranger. Modern genetics has now confirmed something that should have been obvious from the start. Science today treats race as a social construct rather than a biological reality, based partly on physical similarity but with no inherent biological meaning. Humans share over 99.9% of their DNA. The genetic variation within any so-called racial group is almost always larger than the variation between groups. So the races that 19th century scientists tried to carve humanity into were never real biological categories. They were social categories invented to justify decisions that had already been made. So, did ancient humans experience racism? Not the way we define it today. What they had was older and, in a strange way, more universal. A hardwired suspicion of outsiders, rooted in survival, not skin. Racism, the belief in fixed biological hierarchies based on appearance, is a relatively recent human invention. Tribalism is ancient. Racism is manufactured. And maybe that's the most important twist of all. If something this destructive could be built on purpose in just a few centuries, it means it can be unbuilt too.